guys. So what we worked with last class for geometry, we analyzed interior angles, right? All of last week we analyzed interior angles, exterior angles of any polygon, right? Exterior angles was easy because exterior angles would always add up to 360. Interior angles, we needed to use our sum of interior angles formula, s equals n minus 2 times 180 to figure it out. Because for interior angles, the more sides a polygon has, the more degrees it's going to add up to, right? What we're going to be working with today, we're going to start analyzing all these different types of quadrilaterals, right? And again, a quadrilateral is any figure that has 4 sides, right? There's a lot of them. But today we're only going to work with one type. And that one type is going to be called a parallelogram. A parallelogram, right? And what a parallelogram is a specific type of quadrilateral, right? So there's parallelograms. Quadrilateral is anything that has 4 sides. So we have parallelograms, we have squares, we have rectangles, we have trapezoids, we have kites, we have rhombuses. All of these are different types of quadrilaterals because they all have 4 sides. They all have different characteristics. Today we're just going to get started on working with analyzing parallelograms, right? Parallelogram is a specific type where when we have a parallelogram, it looks like a rectangle, but the only difference is instead of where a rectangle is straight and has right angles, 90-degree angles, a parallelogram is slanted, right? And let me try to draw that looks better because this one actually looks pretty bad. So when we have a parallelogram, right, it has certain characteristics to it. And the one thing we know, it has 4 sides automatically. Whenever a figure has 4 sides, whenever it's a quadrilateral, automatically it always adds up to 360 degrees. Anything with 4 sides will always add up to 360 degrees. So the characteristics that we know about a parallelogram, a lot of them are the same as a rectangle, right? So we know that opposite sides of a parallelogram are always going to be congruent, right? So the top is the same as the bottom, right? The top is congruent to the bottom, the left is congruent to the right. That's why we have 1 tick mark and 1 tick mark at top and bottom. 2 and 2 to show that those 2 are the same, right? To show that that has 1, that has 2, those are not congruent, right? So if this was 5, that would be 5. If this was 3, that would be 3, right? So for a parallelogram, we know opposite sides are congruent, right? We also know that opposite sides are parallel, right? That's what those arrows mean. It means that since they're parallel, the top side is never going to intersect with the bottom side. We know that the left is never going to intersect with the right. They're going to be parallel, but since it's different, that had 1, that had 1, this is going to have 2 and 2. Again, all that's there to do is just shows that they're parallel, right? But what we start analyzing about a parallelogram are the angles, right? The angles about a parallelogram, they are always, certain ones are always going to be congruent, right? And the ones that are congruent are always going to be the ones that are opposite of each other. So this angle on the top left is going to be congruent to the angle on the top right, on the bottom right. Just because the ones that are always across are always congruent. So if I put one curve here, I'm going to put one curve there to show they're congruent, right? Now, just those 2 are congruent, right? And then that means these opposite angles are going to be congruent too. But now instead of putting 1, I'm going to put 2, right? 2 there, 2 there, just to show that those 2 angles are congruent, right? Those 2 are congruent. Those 2 are congruent. Always the opposite angles are always congruent, just like the opposite sides are congruent. Now let me show you how this helps with numbers. Okay, if that's 5, this would be 5, right? If this is 3, that's going to be 3, because they both have 2 and 2 tick marks, they're the same. 1 tick mark, 1 tick mark, they're the same, right? If this angle here is 100 degrees, let's say, if this angle is 100 degrees, then automatically this angle is 100 degrees, right? Because whenever they're opposite, they always have to be congruent to each other, right? Here's the trickiest part about a parallelogram. We know that the opposite angles are congruent. There is also a relationship between consecutive angles, angles that are next to each other, right? Whenever we have angles that are next to each other on the same side, we know that 2 angles that are next to each other will always add up to 180, always automatically. If they're next to each other, if they're on the same line, they will add up to 180 degrees. which means if that's 100, this has to be 80, because 100 plus 80 adds up to 180, right? Again, if they're on the same side, they have to add up to 180, right? If this is 80, two curves, then automatically that's 80, two curves. And this is when we start seeing that it's all right. Because again, 180, same side, add up to 180. These two add up to 180. These two add up to 180. Opposite ones are congruent. Opposite ones are congruent. And even more, if I were to add up 100, 100, 80, and 80, 180 plus 80 is 160. 160 plus 100 is 260. 260 plus 100 is 360. Which makes sense because from the beginning we said anything with four sides will always add up to 360. And again, it seems like a lot, but now just actually analyzing it and applying it, it becomes much, much easier to see what you're going to see, right? So let's say again, and all these examples that I'm doing, it's all about parallelograms, right? Let's say that I have this, and I'm telling you right now, it's a parallelogram. Because once it's a parallelogram, I don't need to show all the tick marks, all the curves. Automatically, if it's a parallelogram, all of this is going to be true. So let's say that this was 7 feet. Let's say that this was 5 feet. And I want to solve for A and B, right? If that's the case, we know it's a parallelogram. So if this is 7, automatically we know that A is 7 feet, right? And if this side is 5 feet, we know that B is going to be 5 feet. Because again, parallelogram, opposite sides are always congruent to each other. The top is congruent to the bottom, left is congruent to the right, right? And it's that simple as it really is, right? It's just always applying that idea of seeing everything that's there, right? And again, I do want to show you a few more because there's some that have to do with the sides, others that have to do with the angles, right? I do want to do another one with the side. Let's say that this one here was 4x minus 10, right? And then let's say that this one here is going to be 6. Let's say I want to solve for x, right? We know a parallelogram, so automatically we know that the top is equal to the bottom. This top side is equal to the bottom. So if they're equal, we can write that, right? We know that 4x minus 10 equals 6. And the reason we know that is because we know that 4x minus 10 is equal to 6. Those two are equal, so make them equal, right? 4x minus 10 is equal to this. Those two sides are equal. Because once you have this, then it's just really easy to solve. We want to solve for x. First thing, get rid of the 10, because anything with the variable we do last. Opposite of subtraction is addition. So add 10 here, add 10 there. The 10s cancel, right? 6 plus 10 gives us 16 equals 4x. I just brought down the 4x, right? So 4x equals 16. Now to get x by itself, opposite of multiplication is division. Divide this by 4, divide that by 4. The 4's cancel out. We know that x equals 4. And we got 4 because 16 divided by 4 is 4. Now we're not saying that this side is 4. We're saying that x is 4. Because now if we were to substitute it, 4 times 4 is 16. 16 minus 10, 6. Same thing. So again, that's how we just apply it, right? Knowing that opposite sides are always going to be equal and always going to be congruent to each other, right? But now let's look at the angles, right? Because the angles are also important, guys, when it comes to parallelograms. Okay, just remembering those tricks. And once we have one angle, we can figure them all out, right? Let's say that this is 120 degrees. And I want to figure out A, B, and C, right? Since it's a parallelogram, we know opposite sides are always going to be congruent, right? So if this angle, opposite angles, I apologize. If this angle is 120 degrees, we know that this angle is going to be 120, right? So automatically we know that B is going to equal 120 degrees. We got B, right? That's 120, because whenever they're opposite angles, they're always congruent. To figure out A and C, again, you have to remember, whenever the angles are next to each other on the same side, they're not going to be equal, they're going to add up to 180, right? So if these two add up to 180, in order to solve for A, what we're going to do is 180 minus 120 gives us 60. And that's our answer right here, 60. Because again, whenever we have two angles next to each other, it's always going to add up to 180. Always going to add up to 180. So if they add up to 180, if we subtract the 120, gives us what's left over, right? And 180 minus 120 is 60. So we know 120 plus 60, 180, it's right. Now, if this is 60, automatically we know that C is going to also be 60. Because again, whenever the angles are crossing each other, they're always congruent, guys. They will always be equal to each other. And if we checked everything, if we were to add up 120, 60, 120, 60, all four of those will add up to 360, which lets us know that everything we did was right, guys. Always remember, opposite angles are always congruent, and angles that are next to each other will always add up to 180 degrees, always. Just one more example I want to do with you guys, just so you guys actually get comfortable and see all the relationships that exist with the sides and all the angles. Even if you got a set of equations, it's not hard because it's just known. The sides will always be equal to each other, right? So again, let's say we have a parallelogram. This is 9 inches. This is 4 inches. This is A, that's B. Let's call this C. Let's call this 54 degrees. Let's call this D. And let's call that E, right? Let's say I wanted to find everything. Again, parallelogram, let's start with the easiest. Top side is 9, which means that the bottom side is going to be 9 as well, right? That's 9 inches. These opposite sides are congruent. So if that and that are congruent, we know if this is 4 inches, we know that B is going to be 4 inches too. Right? So far, we got 2 out of the 5 answers. Now, we know that this angle is 54, which means if this one's 54, out of all of those, we know that E is going to be 54. And again, we know that E is 54 because whenever they're crossing each other, whenever they're opposite, they will always be congruent to one another, right? 54, 54. In order to figure out C and D, remember, we know that angles that are next to each other, they will always add up to 180. So if these two add up to 180, and that's 54, we can do 180 minus 54, right? 180 minus 54 is going to give us 126 degrees. So right there, we know C is 126, and we know it's right because, again, if we check, 54 plus 126 gives us 180, and if that's 126, we know that D is also 126. Same idea, guys. Whenever they're opposite each other, they will always be congruent. Those two will always be congruent. Whenever they're opposite, those two will always be congruent. And if you were to add up all 4 of these angles, the interior angles, all 4 of these, the 126, the 54, 126, and 54, they will add up to 360. Just always remember, guys, with the parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent and opposite angles are congruent. But more importantly, angles that are consecutive, angles that are next to each other on the same line, same side, will always add up to 180. And what we call 2 angles that add up to 180, supplementary. Supplementary just means 2 angles that add up to 180. Any questions, guys? Feel free to ask. Take care.